I was never close to my grandfather. Not really. He raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was barely 5. But I grew up more with rules than affection. He was the type who believed that love was discipline and silence was strength. To the outside world, he was a stoic war veteran, a respected community elder. But to me, he was a fortress I was never allowed to enter. He controlled every aspect of my upbringing, my school, my friends, what I read, even how I grieved. I learned early to keep my questions buried and my emotions buried even deeper. And over the years, the wall between us only grew taller. Still, I stayed dutiful, not because of love, but because I didn't know any different. Now that I was a father myself, I had tried to shield my son, Max, from that kind of upbringing. I wanted our home to be filled with warmth, with open arms and honest conversations. Max was bright, curious, and more intuitive than I ever was at his age. And despite the chilly distance between Grandpa and me, I still let Max see him occasionally, because deep down, I hoped the old man had softened. That morning, we were getting ready for my parents', or rather, my late parents' anniversary celebration. It was always an odd day. My grandfather insisted we still honor them, like a tradition he couldn't let go of. But this time, something was off. He stood in the doorway, dressed sharply as always, and said with a tight smile, "You and the boy take your car. I'll go ahead in mine. It'll be simpler that way, for logistics." I looked at him, trying to read between the lines. He didn't offer to ride together. Didn't even ask if we needed help. Just separate. Like always. I opened my mouth to question it, but then closed it again. I'd learned that confronting him only led to cold silence or curt dismissals. So I nodded. "All right, we'll meet you there." As he walked away, Max tugged at my hand. "Dad, is Grandpa mad again?" "No," I said, forcing a smile. "He just likes doing things his way." But something inside me stirred, something I couldn't quite name. A tension that felt too familiar. The kind that always came before the truth tried to surface. And for the first time in years, I felt like this anniversary might not be just about remembrance, but revelation. The road to the celebration wound through familiar countryside, golden fields, rustling trees, and patches of sky that looked far too calm for the way my heart was quietly pacing. Max sat in the back seat, unusually quiet for a Saturday morning. Normally, he'd be humming or asking questions about the birds or clouds. Today, he just stared out the window, clutching his backpack with both hands like it carried something too precious or too heavy. I glanced in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, bud?" He didn't answer right away. His fingers were digging into the zipper, then releasing, then gripping again. A rhythm of nerves. Finally, he leaned forward between the seats, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, Grandpa has no idea I found this." I turned my head slightly, puzzled. "Found what?" His hand dipped into his backpack, and when it came out, he was holding a weathered envelope. Yellowed at the corners, the paper was soft from age. On the front, faded but still legible, was a family crest I recognized from the few heirloom items Grandpa kept locked away in a cabinet. Below it, written in elegant, looping cursive, a name, my mother's, and a date. 2 decades ago. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until my foot eased off the gas. "Where did you get this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Max looked down, as if worried he'd done something wrong. "It was in Grandpa's office. The drawer that creaks when you open it. I was looking for a pencil last week when we were drawing together, and I saw it. I thought it was important. I didn't show him." I pulled the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. My hands trembled slightly as I took the envelope from him. It felt like holding a ghost, fragile, powerful, and too real. The seal had already been broken. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, the same type my mother used to write grocery lists in her careful handwriting. My fingers hovered over it. "Do you know what's in it?" I asked. Max shook his head. "No, I didn't open it. I thought, maybe you should." 1,000 thoughts screamed at once in my head, questions I'd buried for years, feelings I'd long silenced. I looked at my son, his eyes wide and trusting, unaware that what he had uncovered might be the start of everything unraveling. I took a breath, bracing myself. "I think," It's time we both found out. The envelope gave off a faint scent of age, like old books and forgotten rooms. I unfolded the letter slowly, my hands stiff with hesitation. The paper crackled in the silence of the pulled-over car, Max still watching me with cautious curiosity from the back seat. And then I saw it. The handwriting was undeniably his, my mother's, delicate, deliberate, and laced with a warmth I hadn't felt in decades. A single tear welled in my eye before I could even begin reading. I hadn't seen her handwriting since I was a child. My dearest Daniel, it began. My full name, the one only she used. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. If you're reading this, it means I've run out of time, or courage, maybe both. I'm scared, Danny, not of dying, but of what's being taken from me while I'm still alive. The words blurred slightly as my eyes began to sting. I blinked, forcing myself to keep reading. Your grandfather is not what he seems. I've signed things I didn't understand, and I fear I've given him power I never meant to. He says it's all temporary, that I'm too emotional to make decisions right now. But the bank accounts, the insurance policies, even your legal custody, he's shifted them. Forge my name, maybe. I don't know what to do anymore. Every time I question him, he reminds me of how unstable I've been since the accident. But I know what's real. I know love doesn't isolate. It doesn't manipulate. My grip tightened on the paper. My pulse thundered in my ears. If anything happens to me, especially suddenly, don't let him raise our son alone. Please, Daniel, grow up knowing who you are, knowing love. Find your voice, even if he tries to silence it. I've left breadcrumbs where I could. Maybe one day you'll find them. There was no signature, just a small ink smudge at the corner, like she had hesitated with a pen and never returned to it. I sat in the silence, the letter trembling in my lap. All the little things, the decisions Grandpa made for my own good, the people he kept me from, the questions he shut down, they all came rushing back with a new, sickening clarity. This wasn't protection. It was control, and maybe worse. Max leaned forward again, his voice soft. Is it bad? I folded the letter carefully and held it in my hands like it might disintegrate. I looked at my son, the same age I was when everything in my life changed, and I made a silent promise. It's the truth, I said, and it's time we stopped pretending it never existed. I turned the car around. The celebration, the speeches, the polite small talk at the anniversary party, none of it mattered now. Not with the letter weighing down the glove compartment like a silent bomb. Max didn't complain. He just watched me, sensing something deeper was happening, something bigger than either of us could yet explain. Back home, I made Max a sandwich and told him to watch a movie. He didn't protest. He just gave me a nod, that rare, mature look children sometimes give when they know the grown-ups are struggling to keep the world from cracking. I walked up the stairs to the attic. The pull-down ladder creaked under my weight, dust filling the air like memories waiting to be stirred. The attic smelled like insulation and old wood. I hadn't been up here in years. As I opened one of the boxes labeled Childhood, flashes of my youngest self surfaced like ghosts. Grandpa answering the phone before I could, always telling me, wrong number or not important. The teacher I loved suddenly gone without goodbye. Grandpa said she was transferred. The weekend trips I was never allowed to take. The letters from summer camp friends I never received. All this time, I thought he was protecting me from grief. But maybe he wasn't shielding me. Maybe he was erasing the people who might have told me the truth. I dug deeper. Old report cards, birthday cards, a broken wooden toy train. And then, under a stack of school drawings, I found a photograph. It was faded and torn at the edges. Two adults stood on a grassy lawn, my mother, unmistakably young and glowing. Beside her, a tall man with dark curls and a crooked smile. They both had their arms around a small boy, me. But it was the handwriting on the back that froze me. Daniel, age 4, with Mama and Uncle Daniel. 2003. Uncle Daniel? I stared at the man's face, trying to find a trace of memory. Nothing came. I didn't remember him. Not a name, not a voice, not a feeling. Just a gap where he should have been. Why would someone close enough to be in family photos disappear without explanation? Unless Grandpa made sure of it. A pulse of cold ran through my chest. If there were breadcrumbs, like my mother said in her letter, maybe this man, this Uncle Daniel, was part of them. Someone she trusted. Someone who vanished when she did. I held the photo to the light, tracing the figures with my finger. I didn't know where the path was leading me. But I knew this. I had followed Grandpa's version of my story for far too long. And it was time to write my own, beginning with a face I was never meant to remember. I told Max I needed to run an errand and that I'd be back before dinner. He nodded, trusting. I didn't tell him I was going to Grandpa's house. Not yet. Some truths are too heavy for a child to carry. Even I wasn't sure how much of it I could shoulder. Grandpa still lived in the same old colonial house at the edge of town, the one with the perfect hedges and the creaky front steps. He greeted me at the door like nothing had changed, like we hadn't spent the past 2 decades pretending the past was exactly what he said it was. "You're not at the party?" he asked, frowning. I shrugged. Max had a headache. Thought I'd check in on you anyway. He waved it off, muttered something about always being fine, and disappeared into the study with his usual cup of black tea. A few minutes later, I heard the recliner creak and the familiar slow rhythm of his snoring. The house was still lined with the same old grandfather clocks, the same dusty photo frames of him in military uniform. But now, everything felt like a stage set. Too clean, too controlled. I slipped up the back staircase, avoiding the creaky middle steps I remembered from childhood. In the attic, the air was thick with heat and the scent of mothballs. I ducked under a beam and went straight to the far corner, where a weathered trunk sat beneath a draped sheet. But that wasn't what caught my eye. Beside it, tucked behind some old storage bins, was a smaller metal box. Newer, locked. I pried it open with a flathead screwdriver I'd brought in my jacket sleeve. The latch gave with a soft snap, and inside, my hands trembled at what I found. Stacks of documents, legal-size paper with stamped seals and clipped signatures. Custody transfer forms. Power of attorney papers. All dated within months before my mother's death. And one odd page at the bottom, a second version of her will. Unfinished. Unsigned. Her name typed, but the signature line was blank. Beneath the paperwork were photographs. Black and white hospital shots. A woman, pale, eyes distant, with unmistakable features. My mother. Her arm bruised. A small gash above her temple. Her hair tucked back in a way that didn't look voluntary. Each image was dated. All within the last 2 months of her life. I stared at them in disbelief, my throat dry. She had been hospitalized. Hurt. And no one ever told me. Grandpa had always said she passed peacefully at home. That it was her time. But this wasn't peace. It was fear, control, maybe even coercion. I clutched the unsigned will, the photos, the evidence that shattered every lie I'd been raised with. The truth wasn't just hidden. It was locked away, buried under layers of silence. And now, I had the key. The house was quiet. Max had finally drifted to sleep after asking once more if everything was okay. I told him yes, because that's what parents do when the truth is too jagged for young hearts. But the truth was pulling me somewhere else entirely. I drove across town beneath a darkening sky, my pulse matching the rhythm of the windshield wipers. The hospital sat like a monolith of the past, its beige walls faded but unchanged. I hadn't been here in years, not since the day Grandpa told me she'd passed. I remember sitting in the waiting room, holding a paper cup of apple juice while he filled out forms. I never asked questions then, but now everything demanded answers. At the front desk, a tired receptionist gave me a blank stare when I asked for archived records. "I'm sorry, sir, but those files are sealed unless you're the legal next of kin." I slid a copy of my birth certificate across the counter, followed by my ID. "I'm her son." She hesitated. "And the date of death?" I gave it. 20 minutes later, I was escorted down a quiet hallway by a clerk with thinning hair and a badge that read Todd. We entered a records room chilled by the hum of aging air conditioners. After some hunting, he handed me a folder, not thick, not thin, just enough to hold a truth too long buried. I sat alone at the metal table, heart pounding, and opened it. The official cause of death was listed as accidental overdose, combination of sedatives and anti-anxiety medication. But further down, I found handwritten notes from nurses. My hand shook as I read them. Patient expressed fear of her father-in-law multiple times, requested he not be left alone with her, claims of pressure to sign legal documents. Observed bruising on left wrist. Patient said she fell, but looked away while answering. Social worker scheduled for follow-up, case escalated, to be reviewed. And then, a sharp cut. The next page was dated 3 days later, and the tone had changed. Patient found unresponsive in bed. Declared DOA. Family informed. The social worker's report? Gone. Not missing. Just absent, as if it never existed. No mention of the escalation. No reference to her previous statements. The handwriting was different. Clean, clinical. Someone had raised her voice. I leaned back, gripping the edge of the table, breath shallow. My mother hadn't just died. She died scared, unheard, and silenced. And my grandfather had been there, the only constant figure in her final days. Whatever he'd done, he hadn't done it in haste. He'd done it with intention, with patience, with enough power to make the paper trail disappear. But now I had pieces, scattered, fragile, but undeniable. This wasn't just a family story anymore. It was a cover-up, and the silence that had swallowed her was about to break. The study was just as I remembered it, dimly lit, wood-paneled, filled with the scent of old books and polished pride. Grandpa sat in his worn leather chair, legs crossed, a porcelain teacup in his hand. He didn't look surprised when I entered without knocking. In fact, he looked prepared. I placed the folder on his desk, letting it land with a quiet but deliberate thud. He glanced at it, then up at me. You've been busy. Not as busy as you were, I said, my voice low. He didn't reach for the folder, just took another slow sip of tea. I found the photos, the forged paperwork, the unsigned will, the hospital notes. Everything you buried, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained unreadable. You shouldn't have gone digging, Daniel. I shouldn't have had to, I shot back. You told me she died peacefully. You told me you protected me. But you didn't protect me. You erased her. He placed the teacup on its saucer with a soft clink. You were a child. You didn't know what was best. You drugged her, coerced her, manipulated her into signing custody over to you. And when she tried to fight back, you made sure no one heard her. He didn't flinch. She was unstable. Grief changes people. She was emotional, irrational, and the family was watching. I had to make decisions to preserve what little respect we had left. You think the courts would have helped her? No. They would have chewed her up and spit her out. You didn't do it for her. You did it for yourself, I said, my voice tightening. You did it to stay in control, to be the hero in a story you wrote alone. He finally leaned forward. I made hard choices. Choices you didn't have the maturity to understand. I built a life for you. Gave you structure, stability, everything she couldn't. And now you come here. What? Angry because the truth isn't pretty? You should be thanking me. I took a step back, my chest rising and falling. She asked me not to let you raise me alone. And I failed her. Until now. From the hallway, I heard a soft creak on the floorboards. Max. I turned my head just slightly and saw his shadow, small, still, just beyond the doorframe. I looked back at Grandpa, my voice steady. He heard you. Grandpa blinked, the first crack in his composure. What? My son. He heard every word. We stood in silence, 3 generations caught in the collision of truth and legacy. And for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who hid behind silence and called it strength. A man who tried to control everything, but couldn't control the moment his lies unraveled in front of his grandson. I turned and walked out, Max quietly falling in step beside me. Neither of us looked back. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and coffee, sterile, serious, and a far cry from the world I'd grown up in. I sat across from a woman named Evelyn Morrow, a sharp-eyed attorney known for handling estate disputes and long-buried family secrets. Her desk was tidy, her demeanor calm. But when I handed her the folder, her composure shifted. She flipped through the documents, pausing on the hospital records and photos. The more she read, the more her brows furrowed. This is significant, she said finally. Custody fraud. Possible medical coercion. If your mother's death was under suspicious circumstances and records were erased, we may be looking at criminal tampering. And if your grandfather benefited financially from any of it. I nodded. He did. Life insurance. Full control of the estate. Even the second will, unsigned but clearly started by my mother, he buried it. She leaned back, thoughtful. We can open a formal inquiry. Petition to unseal any restricted documents. File for a freeze on his estate pending investigation. You'll need to testify. There may be media coverage. I don't care, I said. The truth deserves to breathe. By the end of the week, motions were filed. A quiet storm gathered behind closed courtroom doors, whispers of manipulation, suppressed reports, and a man who once stood untouchable now summoned to explain the shadows beneath his legacy. Grandpa didn't call. He didn't show up. But I knew he knew. The next morning, I received confirmation. A judge had ordered a temporary freeze on all his financial assets. His accounts, properties, even the house I once called home, all under review. For the first time, his power was no longer absolute. He was finally being held accountable. At home, Max sat on the living room floor with an open photo album spread across his knees. He was quiet, flipping through pictures of people he barely recognized. He looked up at me, then back down at the envelope, the one he'd found, the one that had shattered everything. Without a word, he slid it gently between 2 pages, beside a photo of my mother smiling in a field of wildflowers. She looked free there, alive in a way I hadn't let myself remember. I sat beside him, silent. She deserves to be remembered, he said softly. She will, I replied. Because of you. We closed the album together. In our hands, we didn't just hold photographs. We held truth, no longer hidden, no longer ignored. And for the first time in generations, it would not be silenced. The weeks that followed felt like sweeping through an old house, room by room, memory by memory, clearing the dust that had settled over truth for far too long. With legal proceedings underway and Grandpa's assets frozen, I turned my attention to something more personal. My mother's legacy hadn't died with her. It had just been scattered, hidden, suppressed. I started making calls, following trails that had gone cold years ago. Her old art professor remembered her vividly and led me to a gallery in a nearby town where 3 of her early oil paintings had been quietly donated after her death. They hung there, unsigned, attributed only to unknown. I brought them home. Her letters took more time. A friend from her youth still had a box of them, carefully tied with twine, stored in her attic. Love notes, journal pages, half-written essays. Her voice poured from those pages like a wind that had been waiting decades to be heard. I built a memorial in a quiet corner of the town library, just a small alcove with her photo, a framed letter, and one of her paintings. Beneath it, a plaque read, Emily Rhodes, a mother, an artist, a voice rediscovered. People began to notice. Quietly at first, an old neighbor stopping to read the plaque, a librarian recommending her letters to students studying grief and resilience. And then it grew. I was invited to speak at a youth center downtown. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a public speaker, but standing in front of those kids, some from broken homes, some silenced by their own families, I found the words. I told them how silence isn't always peace. That sometimes, silence is how the powerful stay in control. And that breaking it is how healing begins. More invitations followed. Schools, community centers, even small church groups. I didn't tell the whole story each time. I didn't need to. The message was simple: listen to the ones whose voices were ignored. Protect the truths others tried to bury. Back at Grandpa's house, the curtains stayed drawn. I heard he'd refused visitors. Some said he looked thinner, quieter, like the weight of everything he built was finally pressing back on him. The neighbors stopped waving. The invitations stopped arriving. He retreated into the shadows of his own making, where no one followed. And as for me, each room I reclaimed, each story I shared, each time I heard my mother's name spoken aloud, I felt something lift. We weren't just cleaning dust off memories. We were restoring a life. And piece by piece, silence gave way to something stronger. Remembrance, truth, and finally, peace. 1 year later, the air felt different. Lighter, as if the weight that had hovered over our family for decades had finally lifted, making space for something new, not celebration for the sake of appearance, but acknowledgement for the sake of truth. We planned the event at the community gallery, the same place where her unsigned paintings had once been displayed in the corner as works of an unknown artist. But now, her name would be written in gold leaf on the wall. Emily Rhodes, artist. Mother, voice of grace. The room filled slowly that afternoon. Friends from my childhood, distant cousins who had long disappeared into busy lives, and even a few neighbors who had once called Grandpa a pillar of dignity were now here, curious, quiet. Max stood by one of the easels, adjusting the corner of a frame like a miniature curator. He wore a little navy vest and a pin with her initials. He'd grown since that car ride, not just taller, but more grounded, as if the truth had made roots in him. I took the stage gently, cleared my throat, and looked around the room. All eyes on me. But this time, I didn't feel alone. Thank you all for being here, I began. Most of you knew my mother as a kind woman, a talented painter, a young mother taken too soon. But what many of us didn't know, or were never told, was the strength of a voice. A voice that was hidden, quieted, and nearly erased. I paused, letting silence settle. She left behind breadcrumbs, fragments of who she was, what she endured, and what she hoped for. She asked not to be forgotten, not to be misunderstood. And though it took time, we found her again. Not just in these paintings, but in her words, her letters, her spirit. People were leaning in now. Faces softened. Some wiped their eyes. Some people, I continued, try to bury truth. They call it protection. They call it tradition. But the truth has a stubborn way of surfacing, especially when the next generation knows how to dig. Max looked up at me, his lips curled in a knowing smile. I smiled back. We didn't come here today to rewrite history. We came to remember it correctly, honestly, fully. And in doing so, we honor her. Not with flowers, not with silence, but with truth. There was soft applause, then louder, but I didn't need it. The real reward was watching her name finally take its rightful place, not hidden, not framed in secrecy, but celebrated. As people wandered the gallery, admiring her brushwork and reading the excerpts from her letters, I stood at the back and whispered the final words more to myself than anyone else. He insisted we take separate cars, but in the end, we arrived at the truth together.